Hey everybody, as you can see, we finished a dynamic service on today. We started a new series called Back to School. You know, many times when we're facing a crisis, God is turning it into a classroom. And I'm so grateful that we have a teacher that is patient with us and won't stop until he's completed the work that he started in us. And so the children of Israel have a similar opportunity to learn contentment in the wilderness. And there's some things they learned in the wilderness that I believe we have to learn in life. You've got to go check out the message in its entirety. As always, I want to thank you for connecting with us, for sharing, for commenting, for being a part of Evangel Nation. You are a part of our family, and we love you so very much. We are entering a season of 21 days of prayer, and I want to invite you to be a part of what God is doing. That's one thing I'm certain of, is that prayer changes things. And until we meet again, I'm praying for you. Continue to keep us in your prayers, and we'll see you real soon. Peace. Deuteronomy chapter 8. Lord, bless this word. It reads, "You must obey very carefully all of the law which I am commanding you today. And if you do, you'll live and thrive." Everybody shout thrive. "And you'll go in and take possessions of the land he promised to your ancestors. Remember how the eternal, your true God, led you through the wilderness these past 40 years. He did this to humble you, to test you, to uncover your motivations, to see if you would obey his commands. He humbled you by making you hungry when there was no food in the desert. Then he fed you with manna, a food you and your ancestors had never heard of. He did this because he wanted you to understand that what makes you truly alive is not the bread you eat, but following every word that comes out the mouth of the eternal. Your clothes didn't wear out, and your feet didn't swell throughout 40 years of wandering." I want to just stop right there. I want to switch up a few things because I was really in prayer seeking God for a word. I didn't just want to preach a message. I wanted to preach a word. I want to talk from the subject title on today, Back to School. Everybody say back to school. And this is going to be a class on contentment. A class on contentment. We're back to school. I know that many of you all are back to school physically. I know that we have educators as well as students that have returned back to the four walls and back to their assignments. And after the first week of school, it seems like students as well as teachers are drained. In fact, this Labor Day Monday came as a blessing because it was a long week for both educators and students. Because education is hard work. You serve well and sometimes get paid low. And yet education is so necessary because it gives us a train of thought. Now, whether you believe in formal education or informal education, education is necessary. For my people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. And so all of them have concerns, but we're back to school. As we look at this text, we understand that something very significant is happening. That God is talking about his chosen people, the Israelites, the people who he brought out of Egypt, who had been there for over 400 years. They worked as slaves, and the more they were persecuted, the more they multiplied. And God, true to his word to Abraham, after 400 years, he delivers his people out of bondage. And you would think they would be on a red eye to the promised land, but God takes them through a process. Before the promised land, there's a road they must travel. There's a place they must go, and that place is called the wilderness. Let's be honest, the wilderness is a place that's synonymous with crisis. The wilderness is nowhere anyone wants to live. But all of us must pass through the wilderness. And so God uses this wilderness as a perfect opportunity to develop his people. Because often God will turn your crisis into a classroom. I love the way God operates because there are some things I see coming and some things I don't see coming. Some things happen unexpectedly. And instead of getting angry with God, like many of you, we ask the question, why? And maybe you're in class without your permission. I want to challenge you not to just ask God why, but ask God, what are you trying to teach me in this state? What are you trying to communicate to me while I'm going through this process? Because God knows how to turn your crisis into a classroom. In fact, it was Daniel who was in the crisis that God turns that crisis into a classroom. And Israel, even though they're in an unfamiliar environment, even though they don't like being in a dry place, God's hand is still on them. And so we must ask ourselves a question. And I want you to submit to you that contentment must be a class that all of us take. Because when you understand that you're in a classroom, what you perceive as torture is really training. I want to make this clear that sometimes God puts you in an uncomfortable environment because he's trying to pull something out of you. And when we look at contentment, contentment is satisfaction of the soul. It's when my mind, my will, and my intellect is satisfied. And so I believe this, that it is God's goal that we walk in fullness and completion. I believe this, like Israel, many times we're discontent because we're always looking for the next thing. Because we believe the next thing is what's going to make us happy. We're living in the blessing we prayed for yesterday, but yet we're looking forward to tomorrow for another blessing to bring contentment because we're always looking at what's next. Just like Israel was looking forward to the promised land they were headed to, but they had to take a different path through the wilderness, and they were looking forward to the next thing. And then some of us, we're discontent because we were looking at the past thing. We're looking back at yesterday and the way things were and the way things seemed to work out yesterday. But I want to submit to you that even yesterday had some problems. This is the problem with the children of Israel. The children of Israel forgot that Egypt, even though it fed them well, Egypt also abused them, that Egypt also took advantage of them, that it was not God's perfect will that they would be in Egypt. And so sometimes we look at the last thing and don't realize what God is doing in the present. So we have to be careful that we don't put our hope on hold because we're waiting for something that may or may not happen soon. And so God is strategically using Israel. Understand, Moses is not talking to the first generation of the individuals that were traveling through the wilderness. In fact, Moses is talking to the second generation. Many of their parents have died off. They're on their way to entering the promised land. And so understand this, that Moses has seen people come and people go. Some of you teachers have taught long enough that you've taught the parents and the children. And this is what Moses is doing. Moses is communicating to them because Deuteronomy means second law. In other words, God is allowing Israel to take a retest. And I'm so grateful that even when we blow it, when we make mistakes, that God allows us to take a retest. See, there's some people that will act like they've passed every test that God has given them on the first time, but all of us have sinned and fallen short of the glory. Let's be honest. Some of us have been in the same grave for over a decade because God is keeping on testing us again and again and again. And so Israel is in this same predicament that Moses is talking to a second generation, but you see the evolution of the second generation, that this second generation is more in love with the promise than their parents. Their parents were more in love with their past, but the new generation was in love with their future. And I came here to tell you that sometimes God will let you walk in circles until mentalities die off, until you're ready to partake what he has for you. And so God does something very strategic. He says, I'm going to put you in the wilderness. Put you in the wilderness, and hear this, I'm going to make sure that you're in the wilderness that doesn't have resources. And so he says, strategically, I put you in the wilderness, and I made sure there was no food in the wilderness. Yeah, I put you in the wilderness with no food. So I believe this Israel was looking for food, and they couldn't find food. Have you ever been looking for something everywhere and couldn't seem to find what you were looking for? Some of us have looked for love in all the wrong places and couldn't find what we were looking for. And when they had exhausted all of their options, they didn't have any choice but to look up. See, isn't that how humility is? Humility is anything that makes you look to God. I said, you're not humble if you don't learn to look to God. Watch this. God ensured that there was no food in the desert because, watch this, hunger is one of God's strategies to make us humble. Oh, y'all don't believe it, do you? How many of you all grew up in a house like me? That every now and then your mom would put food on the table. But the problem is you just didn't have an appetite for what she put on the table. And if you had good parents like me, they were not intimidated by your attitude of not wanting to eat. But what they would do is say, listen, you're not going to eat anything else. So they would put the plate there and leave it there, because what they know is that even though that's your posture now, when you get hungry enough, you're going to eat what you rejected. Isn't that how God is? God will put something there. You can reject it again and again, but God is not slack concerning his promises, but he gives a man an opportunity to repent, and he knows sooner or later you're going to eat it, because sometimes God uses hunger to humble us. Y'all don't believe it. Let's look at the prodigal son. The reason the prodigal son returns home is because he's hungry. Because hunger will cause you to humble yourself. That's why God will leave you in problems that humble you, because then you'll look to God, because he gives grace to the humble, and his grace is always sufficient. And whatever it takes for God to get your attention, sometimes he will allow it to happen. And let's be honest, we look to God, but God wasn't our first option. It took a moment with humility to make us look to God. And so he said, I used this wilderness. I made sure there was no food there, because you would have thought that was your source. But I had to get rid of the resources so that you would look to the source. Because humility allows you to receive things you would normally reject. He said, as you were walking, he said, your feet didn't swell. Now, understand this. He said your feet didn't swell. Walking for 40 years in circles, and they didn't have new balances. It seems like their feet would have swelled, but God says you walked and your feet didn't swell. Understand this, that many of these people were kids when they first started walking that are in the present now. So one of the things that causes your feet to swell, some of you know this better than others, is wearing shoes that are too small. Shoes that are too small will cause your feet to swell. When you're going through unnecessary pain, it causes your feet to swell, which suggests to us that while the children of Israel's feet were growing, so were the sandals. that God didn't let them go through any unnecessary pain. Let me give it a modern day vernacular. Some of you got the same testimony that the Israel has, that I've been walking around in circles for 40 years, but I don't look like what I've been through. I believe there's about 3 or 4 people that says, Pastor, that is my testimony that I've been walking. That's why people discount what God has done in my life, because they don't see the residue of what I've been through. But I've been walking in circles for long enough. I believe this is my season to walk into the promise. And so he's reminded them of their testimony, because sometimes God has to point out how good he's been. You don't have any new clothes, but your clothes didn't wear out. Yeah, you didn't get any new shoes, but your shoes yesterday are just as good as they were yesterday today, because God is faithful and his grace is always sufficient. And so what I want you to hear is, some of y'all don't know the blessing. The blessing is not that God gave you something new. Sometimes the blessing is that God kept you. Ooh. I know we don't celebrate the fact that God is a keeper, because nobody likes it. Everybody likes restoration, but we don't like the fact, and we discount the fact that God can keep you in some harsh elements. He can keep you in some harsh environments, because God is faithful. He said, I'll be a cloud by day and a pillar by night, because God will keep you. Watch this, when you want to be kept, and he'll keep you when you don't want to be kept. And so Israel is here, and they're recognizing that God has worked so many miracles, because God knows all the miracles he's worked in your life. And sometimes God has to remind us of what he has done for us, because we miss it. So he's trying to teach them something that many of us try to avoid. He tries to give them a one-on-one lesson on what it means to be content. Because he has a covenant with his people, but they have not learned contentment. This is why their ancestors got in the wilderness, which was better than slavery, and still complained, because they hadn't learned contentment. I believe that some of the people that were in the wilderness are our ancestors, that we can relate to them, because we realize, too, that though the location has changed, we still lack contentment. So first of all, contentment has barriers. Everybody say barriers. Contentment has barriers. The first barrier is craving. Many times when craving is unmet, it can turn into complaining. And I know you're just a praiser and you're not a complainer, but there's somebody sitting on your road that complains more than they praise. Because ungodly cravings will always lead to complaining. And I love this. When you stop placing conditions on your happiness, you've learned the secret of contentment. Some of us having a waiting to exhale moment, but God, if you do this, then I will do that. But God says the secret is learning to take off the conditions of your happiness, because usually with happiness, we're waiting for something to happen. Somebody said this, that complaining is looking for something wrong and finding it. Because you're going to find whatever you're looking for. The Bible says, seek and you shall find. I believe this, that even gold miners understand this principle. Because even though they're dealing with dirt, they're digging for gold. And some of you have started letting the dirt distract you for what you're going after. And so you start complaining about the dirt, not realizing that in the dirt is some gold. And I know some of you dealing with some dirty people, you're dealing with some dirty situations, but I want you to know that there's some gold in it. I love people that can go through all hell and still are able to find the silver lining in it all. Because let's be honest, if we look back over our lives, all of us got a reason to complain. All of us can cry you a river if we told you everything we've been through, all the people who let us down, all the people who hurt us, all the people who took advantage of us, all the people who abandoned us. But when you have the right mindset, you understand that complaining does not make it better. Confessing is one thing, but complaining does not make it better. It's looking for all the wrong and the right. That's how you know you have a complaining spirit. And Israel had a complaining spirit. Yeah, because complaining is looking for something wrong and finding it. Finding it. Finding it. You know, they did a study for the Olympics, and they asked the question to someone. They said, I want to ask you a question. What would you rather receive as a result of winning a competition? They asked them, would you rather receive silver or bronze? And based upon the study, most people said they would rather receive bronze because they said they would be more appreciative because at least they got a medal. Silver sometimes is stuck in the middle. I didn't win, and I didn't lose. Some of you got to look at your situation because the enemy tries to sabotage the way you look at life because he's giving you a silver medal and you're ungrateful when you really didn't have to have a medal. And I came here to tell you that no matter how bad your situation is, it could have been worse. Let me try to guess that. No matter how rough your situation is, it could have been worse. Because the truth of the matter is, sometimes the enemy will keep us in complaints because of our perspective. Because of our perspective. Because of our perspective. And so we don't even recognize when we have silver because he's robbed us of the joy because we're thinking about what we don't have instead of what we have been given. I want to submit this to you that we're complaining because we have a vision issue, just like Israel. Sometimes it's not a hand issue. Sometimes it's a heart issue. And collecting more empty bottles will never quench your thirst. Are you hearing me? Complaining is just collecting empty bottles, hoping it's going to quench your thirst. Look at somebody say, get over the barrier. Somebody said this envy is resenting God's goodness in someone else's life while ignoring the God's goodness in your own life. You got to get over the barrier. You got to get over the barrier. Secondly, boundaries. I love contentment because contentment challenges boundaries. And all of us have boundaries. And the boundary for contentment is wherever. Everybody say wherever. So God is trying to communicate to Israel that wherever, even in the wilderness, you've got to be content. Paul picks it up in Philippians and says, not that I speak in respect of want, but I have learned in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. Watch this. Paul is in school too. He didn't say it was a gift. He said, I learned to be content. In other words, I had to show up for class to be content. Content is not a gift of the Spirit. It's something that has to be developed on the inside of you. But contentment can change your life. This is what Paul said. I've learned to be content because my conditions no longer influence my contentment. Because God wants me content in whatever state I'm in. Can I submit this to you? That contentment is not just needed in the wilderness, but contentment is also needed in the promised land. I need to talk to you for a second because sometimes we only think we need contentment when we have little. But if you don't have contentment when you have a lot, the enemy will rob you of that lot. It'll make you bust some relationships up that you should have kept because you don't know the principle of contentment. Because watch this. The same Israelites that complained in the wilderness were the same Israelites that complained in the promise. Isn't it amazing that God can bless you with the thing you've been believing for, and after one day you begin to complain about the promise? Some of you are sitting beside the promise, and all you've been doing is complaining about the promise. Some of you are driving the promise, and all you're doing is complaining about the promise. Some of you are sleeping in the promise, and all you're doing is complaining about the promise. Because if you don't learn contentment in the wilderness, you won't have contentment in the promised land. If you can't be content with a boyfriend, you can't be content with a husband. If you can't be content single, you won't be able to be content together. Because God is trying to teach us contentment in any condition. It's a hard lesson, but you got to learn contentment. Because you would sabotage yourself in the promised land if you didn't learn contentment in the wilderness. So I'm learning contentment because contentment is needed in every condition, because there's people wanting to end it all that have a bigger bank account than you because they haven't learned contentment. There's people that want to break up in their marriage that's been in less stuff than you've been in because they haven't learned contentment. And Israel had to learn contentment in the wilderness because it was the same contentment they learned in the wilderness that was going to sustain them in the promised land. So they had to learn contentment. Look at somebody say, I'm grateful, I'm grateful. I'm grateful. Flowing from my heart is gratefulness. I had to learn contentment in the wilderness. Because if I'm not careful, I won't have contentment in the promise. So whatever state you're in, you qualify to have contentment. Prince Charming can show up, but if you haven't learned contentment, rolling solo, you won't have contentment with him because you'll find out he's not God. So whatever state you're in, you've got to learn contentment. If you don't have contentment riding the bus, you won't have contentment in a private jet. Because contentment is learned in the wilderness, but it's needed in the promise. So you got to learn to be content. The reason I'm saying learn, because contentment is not automatic. How many of us accomplished the thing we wanted so much and realized it didn't satisfy? You accomplished the thing and acquired the thing you always wanted and realized you still have some emptiness and still have some voids because maybe you acquired but never learned. He teaches Israel contentment in the wilderness because it would be necessary in the promise. And we learn that Israel struggles with contentment even in the promise. Because they should have been content with God being their king, but they wanted to be like the other nations because comparison will rob you of contentment. So God, we want a king like the other nations. We should be content with you. You should be enough, but we really didn't learn the lesson of contentment in the wilderness. Because one thing about contentment, God's going to give you a class in every season on it. But if you don't learn contentment in the wilderness, you'll sabotage your promise. And how many of us have messed up a good situation because of discontentment? Let's be honest. We got to be honest in church because some of us try to be fair. Some of us had exactly what we want and we messed it up because we couldn't be content. Let me help you out. You can't even be married well if you don't learn contentment. You can't be committed to one thing if you don't learn contentment. And it's not something automatic. It's something that has to be developed. Look at somebody say, don't miss your promise. Don't miss your promise. Don't mess it up. Don't miss it because you're discontent. Because sometimes discontentment is deception. But I learned, and I'm learning to be content. Because sometimes with more money, you have more problems. So I'm learning to be content in whatever state I'm in. With more promotions comes more demand. So I'm learning to be content in whatever state I'm in. The reason some of us are battling even suicidal thoughts is because we can't be content with that scenario. Listen, Jesus was so awesome and content, he didn't need to be raised in a perfect family. He was raised in a scandalous family where they called Joseph his dad, but he knew that Joseph was not his dad, and yet he didn't need that to be successful because he was content. Yeah, he didn't have to be born on the right side of the town because what good can come out of Nazareth? He was content. And the truth of the matter is Jesus modeled for us how to be content in whatever state we're in. That's why he's on the boat and he sleeps in the sea, because he realizes that whatever state I'm in, I have the ability to be content. And so if you're not content in your state, maybe you have a lesson to learn. Say, teach me, Lord. Teach me, Lord. I didn't say become complacent, but I said you got to learn how to be content. Because even though Israel was going to move forward, God wanted to teach them contentment. This is why in everything you can give thanks. But this is the will of God concerning you when you learn contentment. You know, there was a story about this turtle called Tommy. And watch this, Tommy was lacking the speed of a rabbit. He was lacking the leaping ability of a frog. He lacked the climbing of a squirrel, but he had something they didn't have. Tommy had a shell. And the rabbit didn't have enough speed for the hawk. And the frog couldn't jump high enough in relation to the snake. And the squirrel couldn't climb high enough for the cat. However, Tommy had a shell that protected him from it all. And I came here to tell somebody that the thing you're complaining about, God is using it as protection. Because while Israel was in the wilderness, God was teaching them the war. Because he knew if they faced their enemies, they wouldn't be able to fight them. So God protected them as in the wilderness. I came here to tell you that sometimes God will use your rejection as protection. And this is why you got to learn to give God praise even when you don't understand what he's doing. Thank God for a shell. I might not be as fast as you. I might not be as smart as you, but I have everything I need. So I don't have to wait till the battle's over. I can give God praise now. If that's your testimony, why don't you give God some glory? I got a shell. I got a shell. There's some things people said about me that should have taken me out, but I got a shell. And thanks be to God who's made me the way I'm supposed to be. So Tommy the turtle learned contentment because he realized everything he wanted he didn't need. Yeah, so you have to understand that this contentment is also a blessing. Yeah, a blessing. Bible says in 1 Timothy chapter 6, Verse 6, it says, this is ironic because godliness along with contentment does put us ahead, but not in ways some imagine. So the Bible says godliness, contentment is gain. So it changes my mindset. Some of you understand that a couple of years ago, some of you did it. I have some family members that did it. That even Chick-fil-A said, listen, if you dress up as a cow, then we'll hook you up. So some of you had the audacity to dress up in an uncomfortable outfit just to go get some gain. And I came to tell you that sometimes contentment is uncomfortable. But if you're contented long enough, that God will allow you to come out ahead of when you started. I came here to tell you that everything you acquire is not gain. Because contentment is a valuable lesson. There was a dog that was crossing a bridge over a lake with a piece of flesh in his mouth and saw his own shadow in the water and took it for that of another dog. In the silhouette, the piece of meat is in his mouth seemed to double in his own size. He immediately let go of his own piece and fiercely attacked the fictitious dog to get the larger piece from him. But in the process, he lost two things. That which he grasped for in the water because it was a shadow, and his own portion because the stream swept it away. See, sometimes it's an illusion when you don't understand contentment. because you lose things you should keep. And what God is trying to communicate to us is that contentment is the only way to gain. Contentment helps us to avoid subtraction disguised as addition. But it also gives us the courage to pursue addition disguised as subtraction. I need to preach to you. I need to preach to you for a second. Did you hear what I said? I said that it helps us to discern and avoid subtraction disguised as addition. But many of us bite and take the bait of subtraction because it looks like it's adding to us. And then it leaves us drained because it was never God's intended purpose for our lives. But it also gives us the courage to pursue addition disguised as subtraction. Some of the things that are going to add to your life are going to appear like they're trying to take away from your life. But when you're content, you don't have to be anxious. You don't move out of compulsion. You move out of the Spirit of God. I came here to prophesy to you that you're about to make more advancement as a contented person than you ever made being discontent, because God's going to give you the wisdom you need to move forward. I came here to tell you that God is about to order your step, and this is what he was trying to communicate to Israel, is that I'm trying to give you some wisdom because I don't want you to make the wrong move and end in losing out on my plan and purpose for your life, because there are times addition will look like subtraction, and subtraction will look like addition. Let's be honest. Some of us have made some decisions. We thought it was addition, but as we look back over our life, we realized it was subtraction. And then we thought some people that were coming to bring us subtraction, we look back over our lives and recognize they added more than they ever could have taken away. Isn't that what happened to the woman at the well? The woman at the well thought Jesus was coming to bring her subtraction, but he really was trying to bring her addition. But because of this contentment, we will mistake the two. So contentment brings gain. Contentment brings gain. Watch this. Ambition does not always bring gain, but contentment always brings gain. And I came here to tell you that I'm about to gain more than I've ever gained before, because contentment is the key. Watch this. Contentment sustained Israel in the wilderness until they could obtain the promise. And contentment will sustain you in your wilderness until you're able to obtain the promise. Contentment is not rejecting the right thing, but refusing to pick up the wrong thing. That's what contentment is. Because the manna might not always be enough, but God's word is always enough. And that's what contentment says, that God, no matter what I face, you are always enough. Contentment ensures that I get gain, and gain is God's best. I got to be honest with you. In this season, I don't want anything that God doesn't want me to have. I want God's best for my life. If you're going to learn how to be content and you're going to believe God for the gain and the provision that he will give you, I want you to give God glory right now. Come on, I'll be content in any circumstance. God said, if you learn contentment over here, I'm going to lead you to a land that's flowing with milk and honey. If you can deal with this manna for a little bit longer, I'm going to bring you in a place where all your needs are met. But when you come to the promise, it won't always be on the surface. Some things will be hidden. But if you trust the same God that brought you through the wilderness, I'll make sure that I sustain the promise. That's what God is speaking to hearts on today. He's saying, you in the classroom, you gotta learn how to be content. You gotta learn how to be content. Because the reason Israel could not get into the promise is because they didn't learn contentment. He says, when I bring you into this land, it's gonna be seeds, it's gonna be figs, it's gonna be vines, it's gonna be pomegranates. They didn't learn it. We're getting ready to close. I wanna make this very clear. I wanna make sure Christ is the center of this entire message. In case you didn't hear, or maybe you missed it, I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes. There is no contentment without Christ. There is no contentment without Christ. I love what Elizabeth Elliot says. She says, the secret is Christ in me, not me in another set of circumstances. You hear what I'm saying? She said, the secret is Christ in me, not me in another set of circumstances. How many of us wish we were in a different circumstance? We were living in a different condition. But the secret of contentment is not being in a different circumstance. The key of contentment is having Christ the center of your life. And I feel like some people have come to church today, your heart broken. I feel like you're discouraged. I feel like you've been stuck in the wilderness and God has abandoned you. Christ might not always get you out of a situation immediately, but he'll step in there with you. And in his presence, there's fullness of joy. And at his right hand, there are pleasures evermore. Some of you have been trying to achieve, and Pastor, you say, I'm just drained, I'm empty. I feel like all of my efforts have come up short. But I want you to receive Christ. He said, come all ye that are weary and heavy laden, and I'll give you